My mother-in-law set the invoice down next to my dinner plate like she was passing the salt. $600 due the first of every month, for use of the family suite. I read it twice before I looked up at her and I smiled. The kind of smile you give someone right before you ruin their night. Then I'll just move back into my place, I said. My husband's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. What place? He asked. He genuinely had no idea what he'd just stepped into. I grew up in foster care in Cleveland, 4 different homes between the ages of 7 and 17, and if there's one thing that kind of childhood teaches you, it's that nobody is coming to save you, so you'd better learn to save yourself. I aged out of the system with a duffel bag, $200, and a community college acceptance letter I'd fought to get on my own. I waited tables through my associate's degree, then my bachelor's, then law school at night, while working full-time as a paralegal during the day. By the time I passed the bar at 28, I had also quietly built something most people who knew me would never have guessed. A small but growing portfolio of rental properties, bought one at a time under an LLC with a name nobody could trace back to me. Financed with a combination of careful saving and a knack for spotting undervalued duplexes in up-and-coming neighborhoods before anyone else noticed them. I never talked about it. Not because I was ashamed, but because money, real money, the kind you build slowly and quietly, is the one thing in this world nobody can take from you if they don't know it exists. I learned that the hard way, watching foster families spend my clothing stipend on things that weren't clothes. So when I finally had something of my own, I kept it close, closer than close. I met Daniel at a continuing education seminar, of all places, both of us bored out of our minds in a conference room learning about updates to estate law. He made a joke about the coffee being criminal, and I laughed before I meant to, and that was that. He was a contracts attorney at a mid-size firm downtown, the kind of charming that made waitresses linger at our table a beat too long, and he came from a family that, according to him, owned half the good real estate in our part of Columbus. His mother, Carol, had built a property management company from nothing back in the 80s, and now controlled, by Daniel's telling, 11 buildings across the city. He talked about her empire constantly while we dated, Carol's buildings, Carol's tenants, Carol's legacy which he would one day inherit and which I, by extension, would one day help manage. I should have noticed how often he used the word inherit like it was already his. When we got engaged, Daniel asked me to sell my condo, a modest 1-bedroom I'd bought with my first real bonus check, the place I was proudest of in the world even though it was nothing special to look at. He said it made more sense for us to live in one of his mother's buildings, a renovated brownstone unit in German Village that Carol was supposedly gifting us rent-free as a wedding present. It's what family does, he told me. You don't pay rent to family. I sold the condo. I told myself I was being practical, that consolidating made sense, that I was marrying into something bigger than myself. I kept my LLC and my other properties completely separate from our joint finances, told Daniel I had some savings and a retirement account, which was technically true the way it's technically true that the ocean has some water in it. The brownstone unit was beautiful, I'll give Carol that. High ceilings, original crown molding, a kitchen I could have cried over. For the first few months, marriage felt like the life I'd always pictured for myself in the group homes, lying awake wondering if anyone would ever choose me on purpose. Daniel chose me. His families, it seemed, had too. Then the cracks started showing. Carol had a way of speaking to me that I can only describe as managerial. Like I was an employee, she was perpetually one infraction away from writing up. She corrected how I loaded the dishwasher during family dinners. She asked, in front of Daniel's 2 sisters, whether I'd really thought through keeping my maiden name professionally, since it might confuse clients about which family I belonged to now. She once told me, with a small laugh that had no warmth in it at all, that I'd done well for myself, considering what she never said she didn't have to. Daniel noticed none of it, or pretended not to. When I brought it up gently at first and then less gently, he'd sigh and say I was being sensitive, that his mom just had old-fashioned ideas about family, that I needed to give her time, 5 months. I gave her 5 months of biting my tongue at dinners, of watching her redirect every conversation toward Daniel's bright future running her company, of hearing myself referred to as Daniel's wife, instead of by my own name in front of her business associates, like I was a job title rather than a person. That Sunday dinner was the breaking point, though I didn't know it yet when I sat down. Carol had invited her business partner and two of her property managers, supposedly to celebrate a new acquisition, a strip mall on the east side. Midway through the pot roast, she slid a single sheet of paper across the table to me, an invoice formatted exactly like the ones her management company sent to actual tenants, itemized down to an amenity fee for the building's shared rooftop deck I had used exactly once. "It's time we formalized things," she said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, smiling like she was doing me a favor. "$600 a month starting the 1st. It's only fair to the other tenants that family doesn't get special treatment forever." The table went quiet. Daniel's sisters exchanged a look. One of the property managers studied his plate like it had suddenly become fascinating. I picked up the invoice, read every line item, and set it back down without my hands shaking, which took more effort than anyone at that table will ever know. Then I looked Carol dead in the eye and said it. "That's fine. I'll just go back to my place." That's when Daniel's fork froze in the air. "What place?" I let the silence sit there for a second longer than was comfortable. "Daniel," I said, "I think it's time I told you about my LLC." I watched something complicated move across his face, confusion first, then a flicker of something that looked almost like fear, like he already sensed the ground tilting under him before he understood why. "You're what?" I didn't answer him there, not in front of his mother's audience. I told him we'd talk at home, and I spent the rest of that dinner eating in silence, while Carol filled the air with chatter about the strip mall, oblivious, or maybe not oblivious at all, to the fact that she had just lit a fuse she didn't know existed. That night, in the brownstone Carol thought she controlled, I told Daniel everything. The properties. The 11 units I owned outright across 3 different neighborhoods, 2 of which were within walking distance of buildings his mother managed. The retirement account that wasn't quite as modest as I'd let on. The LLC, which I finally said out loud by name, and then I told him the part that actually mattered, the part that made him go pale in a way I'd never seen on him before. The brownstone we were living in, the one his mother claimed to own and had gifted us as a wedding present, the building Carol had been collecting rent checks on for 15 years from every other unit, wasn't hers. It hadn't been hers for 14 months. I had bought it. I need to back up because that part requires some explanation, and it's the part of this story I'm proudest of. About a year and a half before any of this dinner nonsense happened, back when Daniel and I were still just dating, his mother's company had quietly defaulted on a refinancing balloon payment for that exact brownstone. It happens more often than people think with smaller property management outfits that overextend during boom years and get caught flat-footed when interest rates climb. The original lender wasn't interested in carrying the debt anymore and put it up for a discreet sale to recoup their position, the kind of deal that gets handled through a broker and a handful of phone calls rather than any public listing. I found out because I still kept my ear to the ground in local real estate circles, old habits from building my own portfolio. When I realized whose building it was, I almost walked away out of some instinct toward propriety. The idea that buying my boyfriend's mother's distressed property might be a step too far into messy territory. But the price was right, the location was exceptional, and frankly, something in me, some quiet, watchful part shaped by years of watching adults make promises they didn't keep, wanted the leverage. I bought the debt and then the building through my LLC, an entity with a name that traced back to nothing recognizable, and Carol kept right on managing it day to day under a property management contract, collecting her fee completely unaware that her actual landlord was the woman her son was about to marry. She had been paying herself a management fee out of rents collected on my building for over a year. The other 6 units in that brownstone, normal tenants, not family, had been sending their rent checks to an account that ultimately funneled back to me the entire time. Carol believed she owned it because nobody had ever told her otherwise. Because the sale had gone through a holding company, and she'd simply assumed, with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything in her life, that the financing had worked out the way it always had before. Daniel sat on the edge of our bed that night with his head in his hands for a long time before he said anything. "You let her humiliate you for months," he finally said. "Knowing this the whole time?" "I let her show me exactly who she was," I corrected him. "There's a difference." He didn't sleep much that night, and honestly, neither did I, but for different reasons. He was grappling with what it meant that his mother had been performing ownership of something she didn't own for over a year, in front of her business partners, her property managers, her own family. I was grappling with something quieter, the specific, complicated grief of realizing that the family I'd married into, the belonging I thought I'd finally found after a childhood with none of it, had never really seen me as anything other than someone to be managed, corrected, and billed. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters. Part of me wanted to let it ride longer. Part of me liked the quiet power of knowing something they didn't. But watching Carol slide that invoice across the table, watching her smile while she did it, watching my own husband say nothing in my defense, something in me decided enough was enough. Not out of cruelty, out of self-respect. Carol's company held their quarterly owners' meeting 3 weeks later, the kind of meeting where she presented portfolio performance to her small circle of investors and partners over coffee and pastries in a rented conference room downtown. Daniel knew it was happening. He'd told me about it months earlier, half joking that one day I'd be sitting in on those meetings as the future of the family business. I asked him, calmly, if I could come. He looked at me for a long moment and then nodded. I think some part of him understood what was about to happen, and after 3 weeks of watching his mother's face, every time the brownstone came up in conversation, completely unsuspecting, he didn't try to stop it. I dressed carefully that morning, the kind of careful that has nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with armor. I brought a folder with me, the deed, the closing documents, the original purchase agreement showing the LLC's acquisition date, and the management contract Carol had signed without ever once asking who, exactly, she was signing it with, since the entity name meant nothing to her. Carol was mid-presentation when I walked in with Daniel, 12 minutes late on purpose, and took a seat near the back. She was talking about the brownstone naturally, using it as her flagship example of long-term value appreciation, the crown jewel of her portfolio she called it, gesturing at a slide with a photo of the building I owned. Her business partner, a man named Frank who I'd met exactly twice, asked a routine question about the refinancing structure from the previous year, the kind of housekeeping question that gets asked at every one of these meetings. Carol answered confidently, talking about the successful refinancing her company had secured, and I let her finish the sentence before I raised my hand. Actually, I said, I think I can clear that up. I'm the one who holds the note on that property. The room did the thing rooms do in movies, except it was real, and I was the one causing it. Carol's expression shifted from polite confusion to something sharper as she processed who was speaking, and then to something close to panic as the words actually landed. Frank looked between us. Daniel sat very still beside me, hands folded in his lap, letting it happen. I stood, walked to the front, and set the folder on the table in front of her, open to the deed. The refinancing fell through 14 months ago, I said, keeping my voice level, almost gentle, because I genuinely didn't enjoy this the way I think people assume I should have. The lender sold the note. My company purchased the building outright. You've been paying yourself a management fee out of rents collected on a property you don't own, and 3 weeks ago you charged me, the actual owner, $600 a month to live in my own building. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. Carol's face went through several emotions in quick succession: confusion, disbelief, something that looked almost like fear as she started doing the math on what this meant for her standing with Frank and the other investors in the room, people whose money she managed, people who needed to trust that she knew exactly what she owned and what she didn't. That's not possible, she finally said, but her voice had lost its certainty. I would have been notified of any sale. You were notified, I said, and I pulled the next document from the folder, the original notice letter the lender's attorney had sent to the management company at the time of sale. The kind of routine paperwork that gets filed and forgotten by busy people who don't expect their world to ever actually change. It went to your office. I imagine it got handled by someone junior and never made it to you directly. That's not really my responsibility to track. Frank had gone quiet in the particular way that powerful men go quiet when they're recalculating how much they trust someone. He asked to see the documents and I handed them over, and I watched Carol's empire, or at least one important brick of it, the one she'd been using as her flagship example for over a year, crumble in real time in front of the very people whose confidence she depended on. I didn't gloat. I want to be clear about that. because it would have been easy to, and some small wounded part of me wanted to. But I'd spent enough of my life being underestimated and dismissed to know that the most powerful thing you can do to someone who's spent years performing superiority is simply tell the truth and let the room draw its own conclusions. I gathered my folder, thanked Frank for his time, and told Carol quietly that I was happy to discuss reasonable terms for the management contract going forward, since I had no interest in disrupting tenants who'd done nothing wrong. Then I left. Daniel followed me out into the hallway, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I watched him fully reckon with who his mother actually was, not the version he'd built his identity around, the heir to an empire, but a woman who'd built her authority on assumptions nobody had ever bothered to verify, including, it turned out, herself. The weeks after that were not easy, and I won't pretend they were some clean, satisfying montage of triumph. Carol stopped speaking to me entirely for a while, then attempted a stiff, transactional kind of politeness that was somehow worse than her open hostility had been. Daniel and I had hard conversations, the kind that test whether a marriage was built on something real or just convenient timing. He apologized, eventually, properly, not for what his mother had done but for his own silence at that dinner table, for the months he'd spent telling me I was being sensitive instead of asking why his wife felt like a stranger at family dinners. I told him I needed more than an apology. I needed him to actually show up the next time someone tried to make me feel small in front of people who were supposed to be family. He's worked on it. We're still working on it, honestly, because trust like that doesn't rebuild itself in a single conversation, no matter how good that conversation is. I kept the management contract with Carol's company for 2 more months, mostly because the other tenants in the building didn't deserve the disruption of a sudden transition. And then I let it lapse and brought property management in-house, through my own company instead. Carol, to her credit, never tried to fight me on it publicly. I think some part of her understood finally that the version of events where she was the benevolent one, handing out family favors, had never been entirely true, and that there was no version of pushing back that wouldn't make that more obvious to everyone watching. I think about that dinner sometimes, the invoice sliding across the table, the smile that came with it. I understand now that it wasn't really about $600. It was about a woman who needed everyone around her to know their place, and who never once imagined that the quiet daughter-in-law she'd been gently humiliating for months held the deed to the very ground she was standing on. I spent my whole childhood being told, implicitly and explicitly, that I didn't belong anywhere, that I was passing through other people's lives and other people's houses until someone decided otherwise. I built a life specifically so that would never be true again. I just never expected to have to prove it over pot roast, in front of a woman who genuinely believed that ownership, like belonging, was something you could simply declare loudly enough until everyone agreed. It isn't. It's something you build, quietly, one decision at a time, until the day someone hands you an invoice for the thing you already own, and you get to be the one who finally says no.